All right, we will go ahead and jump in. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I know we have folks from all across the world who are planning to join us today. So whatever time zone you are in, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and get us started on our screen here and have you all join us right now. Right. Welcome to From Article to Action, using insights from the Foundation Review to make change. My name is Tori Martin. I'm the Director of Communications and Strategic Partnerships for the Johnson Center for Philanthropy, and we are really, truly delighted to have so many folks joining us today for this incredibly important conversation. We would like to start by just inviting everyone to let us know who you are and where you're from. Just go ahead and drop that in the chat when you have a chance, who you are, where you're from, and perhaps your organization as well, just to give us a good sense of who we've got in the room today. We still have some folks joining us as well through the meeting room, so we'll probably get some extra folks from there as well. Wonderful. Hi, Angela, Doug, Marissa, Joelle, Tracy. Quite a few joining us. This is wonderful. We're so happy to have so many folks with us today. Okay. Want to get started with a few Zoom norms while we are sharing who we are and where we're from in the chat. Want to start by alerting everyone that today's webinar is being recorded. We're going to have about a 45-minute program followed by a 15-minute Q&A breakout with the authors. All of our participants will have the opportunity to choose which of our two articles they'd like to go deeper with the authors with. That means that the first 45 minutes will be recorded and shared out with everyone over the next week. We are not planning to share the slides individually, but you will have access to all the content via the articles themselves as well as the recording. We are monitoring the chat for any technical difficulties, so if anything comes up, please let us know there. We can help you out. And we are asking that you share any questions you have for the general conversation in the Q&A box. As I said, we'll have those breakout opportunities near the end of our program, so you may choose to save some of your Q&A for those deeper dive opportunities with the article authors. But for more general questions or anything you think that the broader group would benefit from, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A box at any time. We will have a little bit of time where we're doing Q&A with all three authors, so please feel free to pose your question there, pose it again more individually. You have, we're trying to build as many opportunities for engagement and to get our questions and thoughts answered and engaged with as possible. And lastly, after this program, you will get an email survey to share how your experience has been, and we really hope and encourage you to fill out that evaluation. And now I'd love to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Hanh Yu, who has been editor-in-chief of special issues for the Foundation Review in this, our Celebration 15th anniversary year. Hanh, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Tori. And I want to just start by thanking the entire team at the Johnson Center for Philanthropy. Thank you to Tori, Pat, Emily, Karen, for just making this webinar possible. I don't know about you all, but I come to this being such a super fan. Even before I was editor-in-chief, my tendency is to mark up every single paper, write in the margins, read it several times, and then pass it on to colleagues to just kind of discuss with them all of the amazing insights I get from the articles. And so in being editor-in-chief of special issues for this year to celebrate the 15th anniversary, I was thinking about how can we help our readers go beyond the paper to kind of engage in a higher level of dialogue about this. We had an author roundtable earlier this year to go with the most downloaded articles. That was really fun to hear the author's perspective. And then I kind of thought about, well, what if we had a book club? something where we can meet the authors, to really sit down with them and to talk with them about what you all are reading. So this is the closest thing. So we hope to make it as intimate as possible after they give you the highlights. Hope you've had a chance to read or glance through the articles. I think that will make your conversations even deeper. So now so let me give you a quick overview of what the agenda will look like, and then I'll introduce the panelists or the speakers. So we've selected two papers to highlight in this round. It was so hard to pick because there are so many, and I see many contributors and reviewers on this call as well. So just thank you to everyone who's done that. But so after I make introductions, each of the authors will go for about 12 minutes to give the highlights. And at the end of both presentations, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I have some seater questions to start us off, but please, as Tori said, please enter your questions into the chat, and then we'll get to them. And then after that, we'll break off into separate groups for about 15 minutes or so for you to just engage with the different papers' authors. And we will not go back to the main room again. So just enjoy your time there. And then we'll say goodbye to you at the end of those breakout sessions. I think Tori wanted me to let you know that once you go into these sessions, you can't session hop. So you're going to stay in there and get engaged in dialogue throughout the whole time. Okay, so that's the format. And then, so let me introduce our speakers, our authors. So in the first paper, we have Jane Wei-Skillern. She is a senior fellow at UC Berkeley School of Business Center for Social Sector Leadership, and the author of 4 Network Principles for Collaboration Success. So her talk will be around that. And then after that, we have Jewlya Lynn from Policy Solve, as well as Julia Coffman, the Julias. And Julia Coffman is from the Center for Evaluation Innovation. They are the authors of Passing in the Dark, Making Visible Philanthropy's Hidden and Conflicting Mental Models for Systems Change. Now, I can't help but say, as I'm doing these introductions, that Julia Coffman will not be at the Center for Evaluation Innovation for long. I am her successor as the Executive Director. This is my last major duty as Editor-in-Chief of Special Issues. The wonderful news is that Julia Coffman will be our new Editor-in-Chief going forward. So just absolutely delighted for you to be taking the helm, and I'm excited to see where you take the foundation review. Okay, so that's the introduction. I will hand it over to Jane to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Hanh, and I'm really delighted to be here. And thank you all for taking the time to join us. It's truly a pleasure to have the chance to share what I've learned as a researcher studying leading edge nonprofit social impact networks for the past 25 years. Next slide, please. I want to just assure you that this is not a set of ideas that I've dreamt up sitting alone in the ivory tower. In fact, it really emerged from spending a lot of time listening and learning from leaders as they were coming through. When I started this research early on, let me rewind the clock and give you a little bit of background of where this research even came from on networks, because I started this research early 2000s, and this was a time just after the dot-com boom, and there was a lot of interest in innovation, growth, scale, running these organizations in the social impact space much more like private sector organizations. So a lot of faculty colleagues were interested in managing how to grow, and certainly that was an interest of mine, and how to scale the impact and branding and managing accountability and performance. And I was very fortunate. I came across a number of examples as I was developing case studies to use in my MBA elective on social entrepreneurship. And there were examples of leaders who were working in a fundamentally different way, which was looking at how they could work and build external partnerships with peers and even former competitors to get to scale of impact. So these leaders were worrying less about their organizations and more about how to build that network around them in order to deliver on mission impact. And I became really fascinated by these types of examples. So spent the last couple decades or so focusing on those types of examples where leaders were really leading in a fundamentally different way. And these organizations come from a number of different fields, from animal rescue, social services, education, housing, international development, economic development, environmental conservation. But across all of these, whether they were foundations or they were operating nonprofits in the field, and whether they were large or small, there's a common pattern that emerged across all of these different examples. And that's where I really started to focus in on these 4 network principles. Next slide, please. Because even though they have very different contexts they're operating in, different structures and different mandates, they actually have a key set of themes that are common across all of these successful networks. The first of which is a focus on mission before organization. And that's not to say that the organization doesn't matter, but in all of these examples, first and foremost, key strategic decisions are designed around addressing how can we maximize mission impact. So even if the organization might have a great innovation or expertise, they're very generous about that. It's not something that they hold as a competitive advantage or something that's proprietary, but they actually make a very concerted effort to share that more broadly, even offer free technical assistance to support their peers in order to build capacity in the field, in order to deliver a better impact at the system level rather than organization by organization. Next slide, please. So the next principle is this emphasis on building and working through trust rather than top-down control mechanisms. So even if there are formal contracts or MOUs, that's certainly a common mechanism, but that's not the core of what holds these collaboratives, these networks together. But really, I'd say the leaders and the participants in these networks spend as much time on building trust and building that relational foundation and that sense of community amongst participants as much as they spend on the nuts and bolts of control mechanisms, performance metrics, and who's going to do what, because it's that relational foundation that greases the wheels that enables these organizations to work in that collaborative sense over the long term. And next slide, please. The next idea is just the idea of humility. And again, that's not surprising in the sense that, of course, we all strive to be humble in our work, but so often in social impact work in philanthropy, there's often the focus on our programmatic approach, our organizational approach, and that's how we deliver on mission impact. And that may certainly be a way to deliver on mission impact. But I've seen in these networked examples is that the participants come with such deep humility at all levels, whether it's at the programmatic level and service delivery, where they're as open to listening and learning from their peers and others in the field as they are committed to their particular approach, because they realize that their particular approach is one part of a larger network of all these other attributes and resources that are going to be brought to bear on addressing a problem. And so that humility is important when thinking about the day-to-day work. And at the same time, when there are opportunities for recognition, when they do have a chance to have a light shown on their particular accomplishments, they're very cognizant of sharing that credit and being very generous with it. So an example is in Habitat for Humanity in Egypt, which was one of the cases that I have looked at very closely, is that when they built their 6,000th house within 6 years, and they had kind of scaled up astronomically from building a couple dozen houses in the first year to building a couple thousand houses within 6 years, the CEO was invited to come say a few words at the 6,000th house celebration. And he came and took the stage and invited all his other partners, his network partners, to come up on stage with him. And he said, "This isn't Habitat. We're merely providing support," and gave the recognition as much to his peers and partners to help build that reservoir of goodwill and that ongoing commitment to continue to work together. And so that humility really stands out as opposed to the traditional brand building and self-promotion that we so often see in the social impact space. And then the fourth principle is really this concept of striving to build constellations rather than just be the brightest star. And again, in these networks, these thriving networks, the organizations see themselves as a part of a larger web of actors that are really core to delivering on the mission impact. It's never going to be delivered through the organization in and of itself. Next slide, please. So this next slide really illustrates that concept, and you don't have to get your eyes examined. I know it's really small font. I'll just talk you through each of them. The first slide on the left is really just showing the traditional model of thinking about your work as we're the star organization, we're a dominant player, we're a leading player, we're going to deliver the mission impact through our organization. And the slide on the left shows Habitat for Humanity International in the middle, and then their partners, civic organization, other nonprofit organizations, churches, civic groups, educational organizations, government agencies, all of their partners are right around them. That's the STAR model. And then the shift is the constellation model, where the mission, housing and affordable shelter and affordable housing, is at the center of the model, and Habitat is one of many actors arrayed around the mission. And so there's no dominant model, there's no dominant player, and there really is the emphasis on how do we get to the mission impact first and foremost. And sometimes Habitat might play a very prominent role, and other times they take a back seat and really enable other leaders in the relevant communities to take a lead because they are in a better position to do so. So that shift in thinking really is very apparent in these networked examples. And I should share that Marty Koistra, who's listed at the bottom of the slide, he is a former executive at Habitat. And he shared these slides with me because he and I met years ago when he was a mid-career student. He had a fellowship at Harvard when I was starting on this research, and I was just starting out trying to figure out there's something different here about this network leadership approach. And then he was a student in my elective, and he was leading and working in this way. So I've learned a tremendous amount from leaders like him and others. And this slide is really what he had used to try to convey this set of ideas to his own teams in Habitat at the senior executive level. So I think it really illustrates these 4 principles really nicely. And of course, you can see all of these 4 principles are a bit counterintuitive in the sense that the norms underlined are the ones that I'm talking about as really exemplifying and defining what I mean by a network and a networked approach. And yet they run counter to a lot of the things that are typically incentivized or rewarded in the social impact space, where we often hear of kind of big organizations who are prominent players. And oftentimes when we govern, when we show up and manage and lead, we often worry about control mechanisms and then promoting our brands in order to get more funding and resources and support. And then, of course, we need to be a leading player in order to compete for the recognition and the support. And so there's this tension between what we see as really working and enabling networks to thrive and what the dominant model is in and the norms are in the social impact space. And that's really why I do what I do, because I have seen firsthand from so many different examples the power that networked approaches can enable us to achieve mission impact in a way that you could never do organization by organization. And yet we need to continue to tell those stories and share those insights and the wisdom that comes out of the work from people like Marty and all these other leaders that I've learned from, because I did not invent these 4 principles. They really come from all of the different examples that I've had the privilege and opportunity to study. And it's from those leaders and their networks and their members and their experience that these 4 networks emerge. And they have been robust time and time again. Even when I do conference speaking and I meet other attendees, and they'll say, this is exactly how I've been working my whole career. So it really is a set of ideas that's relevant to all of you, whether you're a funder, whether you're a board member, whether you're a staff member, a senior executive, or member of field staff. It doesn't matter. This is an opportunity to show up in a fundamentally different way, where we get away from the traditional tactical, competitive day-to-day organization-centric approach to one that's focused on trust and building relationships and building community and bringing our whole selves and bringing as much heart to our work as we are bringing our head. And I think really what it boils down to is the golden rule and bringing a lot of love to the work that we do. And I'm hoping that there's an opportunity for more and more people to engage and work in this way, because once you begin to work in this way, it snowballs and gets you really beautiful and powerful results. So I'll just leave you with that thought and share a quote that I think really captures the essence of what this approach really means, which is, the people will forget what you said and they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And I think network leadership really is a new way of showing up with as much care and heart as we can to the work that we care so deeply about. So thank you so much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. You've given us a lot of thought, and just appreciate the comments that are coming into the chat just in reaction to your paper. Okay, so this is a great setup for us to have a conversation later, and the second paper will be presented by Julia Coffman and Jewlya Lynn. So I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hanh, and thank you, Jane. I just want to note that Jane's article has been downloaded over 30,000 times, and so it has really, and that's just from the Foundation Review website. So really resonated and has been an important piece for a long time. Thanks, Jane. Okay, so our article on Passing in the Dark appeared earlier this year in the Foundation Review. And next slide, please. Julia and I are going to go back and forth on presenting a little bit on it. So we, in our article, are speaking to systems change strategists and evaluators, working in any context, but we particularly focused on philanthropy in our article. And we honed in on mental models, which are representations of our thought processes about how something works, because our mental models are extremely powerful. They affect how we think, they affect what we pay attention to, they affect our actions and our behaviors, and they're often invisible and operating under the surface. And sometimes the mental models that we use are not always a good fit with the situations that we are in or that we are working in. They may be based on our past experiences or on incomplete information, as this definition says. So we think, next slide, please. Our article, if you can just hit all of them, thanks. Our article really focused in on a few calls to action. Number one, making our mental models around systems change visible. And Julia is going to talk about a couple of mental models that we articulated in the article, and on making sure, it's this concept of alignment that we're going to come back to in a few minutes, making sure that our mental models are aligned with the systems that we're working in and the problems that we're trying to address, and that there is alignment between our mental models and the approaches to strategy and evaluation that we are using. So we'll come back to alignment. Turn it over to Julia to talk about the two models.
Great, thank you. So we have found that two mental models are particularly common in philanthropy, and we recognize there's actually a lot more than two mental models in systems change work writ large, but these two seem to show up frequently. Sometimes there's elements of both, but often there's one model that dominates over the two in a given piece of work or with a given person in the work, and how it shows up can really influence the systemic change strategy and how partners are working together. So the first one that we talk about is the systems dynamics model. The metaphor we've been using here is the notion of being on a river headed towards a journey that is known. There is a map. It doesn't mean maybe the river hasn't changed course here and there. It doesn't mean all the obstacles are known, but there's a lot about what's happening from the supplies in the boat that you're on to the river you're going down to the length of time it might take that is fairly predictable. In this mental model, we tend to show up in our systems change work feeling like we can define the system. We need to bound it. We need to look for these really high points of leverage. We have a pretty clear sense if this changes and this changes, it's going to ripple out to really fundamentally shift the system and solve for the problem. We have a lot of confidence in the strategy that we craft. That doesn't mean that it's rigid. In fact, we're usually adapting along the way. But our adaptations are to maximize the impact on those leverage points, not to journey in new directions, but to make sure we succeed in the journey we've put ourselves on. This means we can have a lot of pre-planned outcomes, more traditional evaluation. Now, the evaluation still has to take into account the complexity of the context. It is systems work, but you can actually kind of measure against what you thought might happen. In contrast, the second mental model, and this one we do see in philanthropy, but not as often. We've been using the metaphor of a boat navigating the wetlands. And you'll notice even in the picture, this isn't a large, well-supplied boat. Instead, often in this type of work, you're moving through an environment that's uncertain. You rely upon the partners who come alongside you as much as you rely on what you have yourself. You might find yourself going down a portion of the wetlands and it's going really well, and then it's time to really change direction. Your destination, you have a sense of what you want to see it look like, but you can't actually see it, and it's not as known as perhaps in the previous mental model. What this means in the practice, you've done more to define the nature of the problem than the nature and boundaries of the system. You have a sense of what's driving the problem. You have a sense of your systemic context, but you haven't looked for leverage points that are the solution space. Instead, you're in an experimentation space, and your strategy may be experimenting in one spot and experimenting in another, and then really shift. And you don't necessarily shift because of failure. In fact, you can shift because of great success that makes that strategy no longer needed. You might shift because of an external change in the environment that makes it no longer relevant, but you are always shifting. And in order to be in this adaptive space, you have to be listening to the system. And in this mental model, the listening and the system learning is strategy, and strategy is learning, which means your strategy team, they're the ones leading the learning. Evaluation isn't this thing that happens over here, but rather the evaluative thinking and the constant attention to how change is happening is really embedded in that team. So one of the things that we've really begun to notice as we talk with people about this mental models approach, first, we get a lot of folks saying, yes, this explains so much. But then also the question of, should one be used over the other? And what we've actually learned is that some mental models align really well with some systems and systemic problems. So the systems dynamics mental model, it is a great one to use when there is a lot that is understood about the system and the nature of how you solve for the problem. We know a lot about certain systemic issues. We have made tremendous strides forward in certain environments on those issues. And while we can't pick up a practice from one system and drop it on another, nor are we starting from scratch. And so the systems dynamics approach makes sense. In other issue areas or other environments, the level of uncertainty is really high. We haven't solved this type of problem anywhere, or if we have, it's so different in context that we can't imagine lifting one story from one place and bringing it into where we are. This is also if there's a disruption that has changed a system in very unpredictable ways, or the system is itself in the middle of constant and very dynamic change. We want to be in the emergent space so that we can be listening and changing with that system. So both are very legitimate and very important models, and they have their times and places where they have the greatest impact.
Okay, so we want to come back to this concept of alignment now. And what you see on this slide are three sort of areas where we want you to pay attention to the mental models that you have in play, or your teams, or your organizations have in play within each of these columns as well as across them. And so, as you think about the problem context that you're working in, paying attention to the evidence from past interventions and how much that factors into how predictive you think you can be in the strategy, the stability or instability of the system over time, the complexity of the system and the number of subsystems that may be involved and affecting your problem. So those kinds of things will point to the mental model that may be more or less appropriate for your problem context. We also want to pay attention to the philanthropic practices, the strategy requirements, the way we think about accountability, our grant-making practices, all are built on mental models. And so it's important to pay attention to what are the embedded models in those practices? Why are they there? Who developed them? Are they still relevant? Should they be standardized across an organization that may be using different kinds of strategies? And then finally, the same idea with our learning and evaluation practices. Our mental models drive how we think about our approaches. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, we want to point out 3 very common conflicts that happen when our mental models are not aligned across those 3 things. And the first is, and we get a lot of head nodding when we talk about these. So the first is when our problem or the system we're working in really calls for a more emergent approach, but we're using a very predictive systems dynamic strategy, possibly making some big bets that are hard to shift over time. And what you see on the slide are some of the unintended consequences when that happens, where you have a strategy that's really difficult to adapt. And at the same time, your predictions are not playing out as you thought they would. And the foundation may get frustrated and exit that area or do a strategy refresh, which may be damaging to the field. Next slide, please. This one is when we, as evaluators, are using a learning and evaluation approach that is applied to a systems dynamic strategy. And what you'll find here is a lot of burnout on learning processes or learning and evaluation processes that are too frequent and that are frustrating, are experienced as frustrating because it's hard to act on the learning that you're generating. And the final conflict, next slide, is this is a common one where we're using emergent strategies, but applying philanthropic structures that are based in a systems dynamic model. And so we've got very predictive strategies. We've got learning and evaluation that's actually too infrequent, not too frequent, but too infrequent. And doing accountability to the predicting, not paying attention to some of the other outcomes that may be emerging positive or negative. So again, our routines, our practices, our tools all have mental models embedded in them. So important to pay attention to as well. And I'm going to turn it back to Julia to finish this up.
So one of the big questions we've been getting is, okay, I see my mental model. I see what my organization's mental model and philanthropic practices are grounded in. I see the mental models of my partners. Now what? And I think there's a couple ways to think about it. One is just by paying attention and making them visible, you can open up opportunities for conversation. You can grapple with when they seem to be getting in the way. You can have visibility into something that usually we don't take the time to talk about. You can go a little further, though, and really actively seek to mitigate the ways in which conflicting mental models cause harm. For example, you might upfront renegotiate some of the philanthropic rules of the road and practices if you recognize that an emergent strategy is a very necessary part of the work. We don't say that you have to jump all the way to this last one of embracing a shared mental model. This notion of aligning can be really powerful. Not arguing you should never do it, but aligning your mental models requires releasing some of your thinking, releasing some of your structures, releasing some of your practices. And I think that by having your eyes wide open and mitigating the harm, you get closer to being in a place where you can embrace a shared model. And it may be that there's actually benefit too in the tension of different models, because there isn't really a right answer when you're doing systems change work. Moving on to the last slide. So because we have gotten so much conversation in the last 3 or 4 months since the article came out, we created a Systems Mental Models LinkedIn group as a space where folks can prompt and ask questions, find out who else is interested in this. And also there's an upcoming School of Systems Change learning session to go deeper into the what do we do about it. The link is in the chat. It's also available on the LinkedIn group. Part of what we're looking for and interested in is a collective dialogue and beginning of having more examples of how people's mental models are playing out in different systems and how we're adjusting them once they become visible. So we hope you join us there for the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane and Jewlya Lynn and Julia Coffman. I think I've been through your presentations a couple of times and I'm still getting so much out of them. So just appreciate all the kind of how you've laid it out just in terms of provoking us to think. And in fact, I'm going to kick us off for the Q&A. Please put in your questions or comments in the chat, but let me kick us off. I'm just curious, as you're kind of sharing your doing presentations and have been sharing your paper, what are some of the most provocative questions you're getting from readers? You know, what topics of conversations or what conversations are you having? I'll start with Jane.
Thanks. So I think one of the things is that even though there's so much talk about collaborative efforts, systems level, ecosystem approaches, system catalysts, network leadership, trust-based leadership, frankly, I don't care the terminology so much. I'm not particular about that. But people are often still finding this is an uphill battle to work in this way, that it's easy to change our language, but to actually reflect and see how are our behaviors, our actions, our policies, our strategies still entrenched in that older or a different mindset is still a struggle. So a lot of the leaders who work in this way are still flying under the radar and have to convince their own staff and their own boards and don't know if they'll get funding because their funders don't understand or support this less concrete way of working. It's not that it's not more effective, but it's just harder to take credit. It's harder to manage and control. So I think that's the biggest challenge. And that's where I think all of us have a role to play, is sharing the successes and sharing the stories of when we've been part of or seen examples of thriving collaboratives that emerged because people treated each other with this degree of trust and respect and mutual humility that, again, I think aren't the norms that are incentivized all the time, but I think the more we do it, the better off we all are.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. And how about Julia? What are some of the conversations you're having that's provocative? Let's follow up.
I'll take that. So I think some of we've had a lot of interesting conversations, but I think one of the things that has really been interesting for me is explorations of, once people are aware of, oh, this is the model that I've been using, is the conversation about why. Like, why, where is that coming from? Is that because it's based on your fundamental beliefs about the system? Is it based on something a consultant brought to the conversation? Is it based on the fact that in our organizations, often our routines and practices are, were developed 10 years ago, we're still using them, but are they appropriate to the situation that we're in? Is it because that, like I said earlier, we're standardizing practice across an organization when in fact we have different kinds of strategies in play? So I think that question about once you're more aware of how you're thinking, to really get at why.
Great, thank you. Why, Julia? Thank you for raising that. Okay, and then so my next question, and I know Doug has a very interesting comment in there. Let me just ask this one, and we'll go to comments. Is I see in both of your papers some sort of shifts in thinking about the mindsets that we bring to this. So just curious, what's missing if funders or philanthropy doesn't adopt a network collaborative orientation or systems thinking mental model? What are they missing out on? Let's start with Jewlya Lynn and then go to Jane, maybe.
Sure. I think I would make the argument that there is no such thing as a missing mental model. They're always there. What's missing is awareness of how your own mental model, your organization's mental model, your partner's mental models are influencing how you do the work and also how you communicate about the work and ultimately the impact of the work. So I think the risk is when we don't take time to really stop and challenge our thinking and understand where it's coming from, we are barreling ahead a little bit blind. And we're asking our partners to read our minds about why we're making the choices we're making. It's a way of building trust. It's a way of shifting power when you can be vulnerable enough to say, this is the way I understand systems to change, and I may or may not be right.
Wow, great. Jane.
Yeah, thank you. I think so much of what Julia says is really right on as far as hitting the nail on the head of what the opportunity is. There's such tremendous opportunity for impact if we're willing to let go of control with trusted partners and work as peers and as equals. And the missed opportunity is really if we're content with continued incremental change that allows us or is causing us to continue to lose ground on so many serious and challenging issues in our current situation, that's what will be in the current status quo. And that is, I think, the cost. The opportunity, however, is that we could potentially achieve transformational change that really is a fundamentally different way of working that requires a different approach, and that I think the world would be better off if we were able to adopt these principles and these norms more broadly, because as I mentioned, it really is very simple in the sense that it is the golden rule and showing up in a different way. That's not this top-down control. I hold the resources, so I know best, and kind of dictating to others how things should be done, but much more leading with a sense of humility and openness and willingness to listen. So, and learn. So yeah, I think this is the only way forward, frankly, as far as overcoming so many of the challenges that we as humanity face.
Great. I mean, what I'm hearing both of your responses that funders need to shift their stance, and they're more likely to enhance understanding and results by admitting that they don't know all the answers, and that it's something that's kind of created together with our partners in the communities.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, well, I'd love to invite Doug to unmute and just kind of share your comments and question that you have in the chat. It's so interesting.
Hey, so this was a really timely article. I really appreciate the two of you putting this together. So I've been involved in lots of place-based initiatives and collaborative work where funders have come in with different perspectives, and typically either they have defined the system on the front end, in which case you would do the systems dynamic, or they just name the problem, and then I think the emergent model is really useful to kind of get out there as the appropriate way to go forward. But there's been a kind of a movement in the place-based world in the past 10 years where the funder isn't very specific on the front end about what it is that needs to change. They've got some notion of typically related to equity, and then they're working with folks, local actors, to draw out the particular lines of place where you might expect to see change, and then eventually you would get to the necessary systems. So that feels like a third mental model that the funder brings to this, and it's sort of, is that part of your kind of paradigm or taxonomy?
I would make the argument that when a funder has a process in place. This is how we will work with people, and that is going to lead to systemic change. That is actually a systems dynamics model because the process is the intervention that they believe is transformative. Some of our trust-based philanthropy work is functioning this way right now, where if we fundamentally change how we show up and engage, then a problem can be solved by those who are closest to it. A systems emergence model is a little bit more of the, actually to bring in Jane's work, it's a little bit more of a, we're at a table with others and we're not exactly sure how, but collectively we're going to figure out and understand and experiment and try things together in this system. We may not even all come into the table because we've defined the same problem, but we have enough shared interest and enough kind of commitment to the values of equity that we can advance change and learn from each other. There is an organization that started over a decade ago where the funders came together and said our field is stagnant and has no experimentation and no innovation. And we think that if we could just be more innovative, new solutions would emerge. So we're going to create this organization, and their only charge is figure something out. Come on, people, do something different. That to me was a great example of the funders held a systems dynamics mental model of the system has to be disrupted. This group of actors are stuck, but the work itself sat solidly in emergence. And the job of the funders became not allowing their mental model to get in the way of it. And that's a lot of what the funder table really focused on. So another thing I would say is don't get caught in the assumption that the funder has to hold the same model as the partners, or that there has to be one model, but we have to understand how they show up together.
Great. Thank you so much. By the way, Doug is one of the most prolific contributors to the Foundation Review. So just thank you for coming to this. And now you have a face with a name if you haven't met him. Great. Okay. Thank you for everyone. I want to make sure you all have real ample time with the authors. So we're going to put into this part of the session and then go into the small groups so that you have more dialogue. So pick your group. I think some sort of option will come up for you to select, and just happy conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you to the authors so much.
Just want to thank everyone again for joining us. I'm going to open these breakout rooms in just a moment. You'll have the option to select whichever one you want to join. Unfortunately, as Han mentioned at the beginning, we will not have the opportunity to jump back and forth between the breakout rooms, but that does not mean by any means that the conversation needs to end. We dropped the email addresses for our wonderful presenters into the chat earlier, but you can always also reach out to us at the Johnson Center for those communications again. And you can always find the Foundation Review at johnsoncenter.org/the Foundation Review. So here are the breakout rooms.